The morning sun stretched pale fingers across the dry, cracked earth of the frontier settlement, illuminating the rough-hewn cabins and dusty streets that made up Marisol's world. Birds flitted from fence post to fence post, their songs seeming almost ironic against the harsh whispers that trailed behind her as she walked. Marisol was not just another girl of the village, she was its pariah. The scar on her belly, a cruel, red-branded mark, made sure of that. It had not always been this way. Once she had been just another girl, bright-eyed, curious, and hopeful. She had laughed with the other children, helped her mother with chores, and dreamed of a life filled with love and opportunity. But a scandal, whispered and twisted, had changed all that. No one had bothered to confirm the story. No one had sought the truth. By the time the rumors settled like dust in every corner of the village, Marisol had already been branded. The scarlet mark was more than skin deep. It was a sign of shame, a declaration to every man who looked upon her. Not for you. She touched the burn lightly, her fingers tracing the uneven line, and shivered. It had been 3 months since the branding, yet the sting remained, both physical and emotional. Every day she felt the eyes of the villagers on her, some full of pity, others full of judgment, most of them filled with quiet satisfaction. They had succeeded in their goal. She was isolated. She was supposed to be unwanted, unworthy, and alone. Her cabin sat on the edge of town, a small, uneven structure built by her father before he passed. The walls were crooked, and the roof leaked when the rain came, but it was hers. Out here, the whispers faded with the wind, and she could hear herself think. But even in solitude, Marisol's mind was never truly free. The village's judgment clung to her like a second skin. She could still see their faces in her mind, the women's tight-lipped stares, the men's cold sneers, the children's curious eyes that turned away too quickly to hide their fear of what they had been told about her. Marisol had learned to move quietly through the village, keeping her head down, avoiding encounters whenever possible. She went to the well early in the morning when only a few farmers came to draw water, and she returned long before the marketplace bustled. She learned the paths through the woods that ran behind the settlement, paths where she could hunt small game and gather herbs without interruption. In these moments of solitude, she felt a flicker of freedom, a reminder that her spirit had not been completely broken. Even so, the mark on her belly was a constant reminder that freedom was limited. She wore high collars and loose clothing, hiding what the villagers wanted to see. Each time she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, a crude slab of polished wood nailed to the cabin wall, she was reminded of what had been stolen from her. The simple possibility of being desired, of being loved, of being human in the eyes of her own people. Yet despite the pain, Marisol carried a quiet defiance. The branding could not claim her mind or her courage. She tended her small garden, repaired her cabin, and practiced archery with makeshift targets she carved from wood. These small acts of self-reliance were her rebellion against a world that sought to define her by a single moment, a single misunderstanding. On this particular morning, she walked toward the woods, boughs slung across her back, her eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The village had begun its day, and she felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach, the one that never left when she was near people who believed she had no value. But as she stepped off the edge of the road and into the shadowed path of the trees, the knot loosened. Here, in the quiet of the wilderness, she could breathe. Here, no one knew her story, no one could judge her, and no one could brand her spirit. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Marisol paused and let it fill her lungs. In that moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond whispers and scorn, a life where she was seen not as a scar, but as a person, a life where she could walk freely and be wanted not because of the absence of a brand, but because of her courage, her kindness, and her fierce heart. Though the village had tried to mark her body, It had not yet touched her soul. And that, she decided, was something no brand could ever take. The days stretched long and quiet for Marisol, each one a mirror of the last. The settlements rough, wooden houses huddled together like frightened animals against the wind, and Marisol's own cabin perched at the edge of the village, separated from the others by a thin line of scrub and brush. It was here, in this space between civilization and wilderness, that she had been forced to make a life for herself. Her isolation was both imposed and self-imposed. The villagers rarely spoke to her directly, and when they did, their words were coated with disdain. Children would point and whisper, mimicking the cruel tales adults had spun. Men averted their eyes, muttering excuses when she passed, while women cast cold, suspicious glances. The scarlet mark on her belly, visible only to those who looked closely, was a silent proclamation of shame, and it had become the lens through which everyone in the settlement judged her. Marisol had learned to move through the village almost invisibly. She left early in the morning to fetch water from the well, careful to avoid the gossiping women who congregated there. She lingered only long enough to fill her pails, speaking only when necessary, her voice low and firm. By mid-morning, she would return to her cabin, taking a meandering path through the trees to avoid anyone who might recognize her. Each encounter, no matter how brief, reinforced her sense of exile. Inside her cabin, Marisol had crafted a small world of order and routine. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of dried herbs and roots, a few books she had salvaged, and handmade tools. A small fire crackled in the hearth, providing warmth against the chill that crept through the thin walls. Here, she could control something, however small, and it gave her a sense of purpose. She tended her garden meticulously, coaxing life from the stubborn, dry soil. Tomatoes, beans, and herbs grew in neat rows, and the act of caring for them became a meditation, a reminder that life could still flourish even in the harshest conditions. She hunted small game with her bow, practicing patience and precision. The act of tracking, of following footprints and scents through the forest, gave her a feeling of control and skill that the village denied her. Each successful hunt was a quiet victory, a reassurance that she could survive on her own. Yet the isolation weighed heavily on her. Nights were the hardest. When the wind howled through the trees and rattled the cabin's thin windows, she felt the emptiness of her life, pressing in from all sides. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the world beyond the village, a world where she could be free from shame and fear. She longed for companionship, for someone to see her not as a branded outcast, but as a whole, living person. The dream felt impossible, yet she clung to it, a fragile ember of hope in the darkness. Even her own reflection reminded her of the village's cruelty. She had a small mirror, scratched and dull, yet it betrayed the truth. The brand was permanent, a scarlet slash that no clothing could fully hide. When she caught sight of it, she felt the sting of humiliation anew. She hated it, yet she could not deny that it was a part of her now, a constant reminder of how society could twist fear and superstition into cruelty. Despite everything, Marisol refused to break. She spoke to the trees, to the birds, and to the animals she raised and hunted. She whispered her thoughts aloud as she worked, telling herself that these conversations kept her mind sharp and her spirit alive. The forest, though silent and indifferent, became her confessor, her teacher, her companion. She learned which plants could heal and which could harm, how to read the sky for signs of coming weather, and how to move silently enough to observe, deer without being seen. Occasionally, she would venture closer to the village, pretending to gather firewood or check on supplies. From a distance, she could see the marketplace bustling, people laughing and trading, a world of human connection that seemed forever out of her reach. She ached to join it, to be part of something, yet each attempt reminded her that the brand had set her apart. Every glance from a villager, every whispered comment, reinforced the walls that society had built around her. But Marisol's spirit was resilient. Every task she completed alone, every meal she prepared, every animal she tended, reinforced her independence. Isolation had forced her to learn, to adapt, and to survive. Though she longed for acceptance, she was beginning to understand that she did not need the village to define her worth. Her strength, her skill, and her courage were her own, unclaimed and unbranded by anyone but herself. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the sky bled orange and pink, Marisol stood at the edge of her garden, bough in hand, watching the shadows stretch long across the earth. In the quiet of the evening, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She was alone, yes, but she was alive. She was capable. And though she did not yet know it, she was about to meet someone who would see her as she truly was. Someone who would not care about the brand or the lies that had been told. Someone who could offer her a chance at freedom beyond the isolation she had known for so long. The quiet of Marisol's cabin was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the memories that refused to remain buried. Even in the heart of the forest, where the wind whispered through the pines and the birds called to each other without judgment, the past clung to her like a shadow. Each night, as she lay on her thin mattress, it returned, not as a gentle memory, but as a relentless echo of shame and betrayal. It had begun years ago, before the scar had ever burned her skin. Her family had been respected in the settlement, known for their honesty, their hard work, and their quiet pride. Her father had taught her how to track deer, how to read the signs of the weather, and how to listen to the land. Her mother had filled their cabin with warmth, weaving stories into the threads of everyday life, teaching Marisol to speak kindly, to hold herself with dignity, and to trust in truth. Then came the accusation. It was subtle at first, whispered, behind closed doors, but it grew like wildfire. A neighbor claimed something unthinkable, a story twisted and stretched until it took on the weight of fact. No one asked Marisol what had happened. No one sought to understand her side. By the time the story reached the ears of the village elders, it had been molded into a verdict. She was guilty, dangerous, unfit. And in their judgment, her body had to bear the evidence. The day of the branding was a blur of heat, smoke, and fear. She had been dragged into the center of the settlement, the villagers forming a rough circle around her. Their eyes burned with expectation, with a sense of duty to morality they did not understand, and with a quiet, vindictive satisfaction. Marisol had struggled, screamed, begged for someone, anyone, to see the truth. But their ears were deaf, their hearts closed. The iron had seared into her skin, leaving not just a physical wound, but a permanent testament to their cruelty. Marisol shivered as she recalled the searing pain, the sound of whispers, and the laughter that had followed. She remembered the way the children had been forced to look, the way the men had turned away, ashamed yet triumphant, and the women who shook their heads as though she had somehow invited the punishment. The scar burned now, as it had then, not just on her belly but in her memory, each pulse a reminder of the village's judgment. It was not just the branding that haunted her, it was the betrayal of trust. Friends she had once confided in had turned their backs, repeating the rumors with eager mouths. Even those who had shown her kindness before had been swallowed by fear, leaving her to face the world alone. She remembered nights of tears, curled on the floor of her room, clutching her knees and begging for mercy from a God who seemed to have abandoned her. But the past was not only pain, it was also a teacher. In the quiet aftermath, Marisol had learned to read the intentions of others, to anticipate cruelty and to protect herself. She had learned to move without attracting attention, to mask her emotions, and to survive. She had cultivated a careful, deliberate independence that kept her alive in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. The memories, though bitter, had forged her strength, teaching her resilience in ways that comfort and safety never could. At times, She wondered if she would ever be free of it. The brand was a physical scar, but the judgment and mistrust it represented was something deeper, lodged in the eyes and minds of every villager. Even those who treated her with neutrality carried the seed of suspicion, and Marisol felt it every time she entered the settlement. She had learned to anticipate the whispers, the sideways glances, the abrupt silences. It was a burden she bore, silently, one she could never share without risking further misunderstanding. And yet, despite the weight of memory, Marisol clung to the faint hope that not everyone would follow the village's cruel logic. Somewhere beyond the settlement, she imagined there might be someone who would see her for who she truly was, a person capable of courage, love, and resilience. Someone who would recognize the strength behind her eyes, the intelligence in her movements, and the fire that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of betrayal. As she traced her fingers over the scar on her belly, she allowed herself a small, private act of defiance. The village might have marked her, might have tried to claim her as undesirable, but they had not taken her mind or her spirit. The past could haunt her, could burn into her memory, but it could not dictate her future. Not yet. Not entirely. Marisol rose from her cot, her gaze moving toward the window that framed the forest beyond. She could hear the distant sounds of the village winding down for the evening, but she no longer felt compelled to watch, to anticipate judgment. Her life was here, in her cabin, in the forest, in the small acts of survival she performed each day. And though the past would always be a part of her, she understood that it need not define the entirety of her existence. Tonight, she decided, she would sleep not as a branded girl, not as the village's outcast, but as someone who had endured, who had survived, and who, one day, might find the freedom and recognition she had long been denied. Marisol's days had settled into a predictable rhythm, a careful balance between survival and solitude. But the forest, vast and untamed, had a way of reminding her that life was never truly predictable. One morning, as the sun climbed slowly above the distant hills, she noticed something unusual. The faint imprint of footsteps in the soft earth, near the edge of the trees. Large, deliberate, and unlike any she had seen before, they moved with a confidence that spoke of skill and purpose. Her hand went instinctively to her bow, string taut, eyes narrowing as she crouched behind a thick oak. She observed silently, noting the way the figure moved with grace and awareness, each step measured and cautious, yet unafraid of the wild. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the sunlight in hints of copper. His skin was sun-kissed, and his eyes held a quiet intensity, sharp and observant. Marisol's first instinct was fear. The village had taught her to mistrust strangers, and she had long believed that isolation was her safest refuge. Yet there was something different about this man. There was no malice in the way he scanned the trees, no sense of immediate threat. Even his movements, careful yet deliberate, suggested a familiarity with the land that mirrored her own. For hours, she watched from the shadows, curiosity slowly winning over caution. The stranger made no attempt to approach the village, nor did he seem interested in its people. He seemed at peace in the wilderness, as if the forest itself welcomed him. Marisol felt an odd sense of kinship with him, a silent recognition of someone who understood the rhythms of life beyond the confines of human judgment. When he finally noticed her, though not immediately, she froze. His gaze was steady, calm, and without the judgment she had grown accustomed to. There was an unspoken acknowledgement, as if he could see her presence without needing to challenge it. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she did not feel immediately threatened or shamed. Days passed, and the figure appeared again, always at a distance, moving through the forest with the same quiet purpose. Marisol began to anticipate his presence, feeling a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a strange, unnameable hope. Each encounter, though wordless, conveyed a sense of understanding, a silent dialogue between two solitary souls who had survived hardship and learned to read the world with precision. One afternoon, Marisol was tending her small garden when she heard the crack of a branch nearby. She froze, heart pounding, bough raised. But instead of an animal or a hostile figure, she saw the same man emerge from the trees. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible, body relaxed. There was a faint smile on his lips, one that carried no threat, only quiet acknowledgement of her vigilance. "Good morning," he said, his voice low, calm, and resonant. It was not a voice that demanded obedience or respect. It was simply there, steady and unassuming, like the forest itself. Marisol hesitated, unsure if she should respond. Years of isolation and mistrust made speech feel dangerous. But there was no mockery in his eyes, no hint of judgment, only curiosity and awareness. "Good morning," she replied cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. They did not speak long that day. The man seemed content to remain at the edge of the garden, observing without encroaching. He offered no explanations, asked no questions, and made no assumptions. And that perhaps more than anything was disarming. For Marisol, who had spent so long hiding from a world eager to condemn her, the simple act of being seen without judgment was revolutionary. Over the next days, a pattern emerged. The stranger would appear, always at a distance, and watch without intruding. Marisol, in turn, began to emerge slightly from her seclusion, allowing herself glimpses of connection she had thought impossible. She began to notice details about him, the way he moved, the care in his steps, the attentiveness to his surroundings, and she felt a stirring of something long dormant, the possibility of trust, the faint glimmer of companionship. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, one evening, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Marisol realized something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: hope. It was fragile, easily shattered by the weight of the past, but it was there, somewhere beyond the judgment, beyond the scars, beyond the cruel whispers of the village. There might exist someone who would see her as she truly was. And perhaps, she thought quietly as she watched him disappear into the trees, the forest had sent this stranger for a reason. A visitor, a witness, or something more. She did not yet know. But she knew this. Her life was about to change, whether she was ready or not. The day had been unusually still, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every sound seem louder than it was. Marisol moved carefully through the forest, bough slung across her back, a small bundle of herbs in her hand. She had learned to read the subtle cues of the wilderness, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the whisper of the wind, and today, something felt different. The air carried a weight she could not place, a sense of presence that made her pulse quicken. Then she saw him. The Comanche was closer than usual, stepping lightly over roots and rocks, his eyes scanning the forest, as if every movement mattered. His gaze lifted briefly, and for a heartbeat, it met hers. The effect was electric, neither fearful nor threatening, but commanding a recognition that startled her. She instinctively ducked behind a tree, holding her breath, heart hammering. "Do not be afraid," the man called softly, his voice carrying easily over the distance. It was a strange combination of calm and authority, and Marisol found herself frozen not by fear, but by curiosity. She hesitated. In all her life, in the months of solitude, no one had spoken to her with such ease, such lack of judgment. She studied him from her hiding place, noting the lines of his face, the alertness in his movements, the way he seemed attuned to the world around him in a way that mirrored her own vigilance. For all his presence, he was careful, respectful, of boundaries she had long thought impassable. I don't know who you are," Marisol said finally, her voice small but steady. She stepped slightly from behind the tree, testing the air, testing him. "I am called Takoda," he replied. "And you are—" She paused. Her name felt strange in her mouth, heavy with shame and old pain. "Marisol," she said quietly. It was more than a name. It was an assertion of identity, a small rebellion against the world that had tried to brand her as less than human. Takoda nodded once, a subtle gesture, but it carried weight. "Marisol," he said, rolling the sound carefully over his tongue. "You walk the forest with knowledge. You are careful, quiet, skilled." His observation was simple, almost factual, but it carried a recognition that made her heart lift. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not for a scar or a rumor, but for the person she was. Marisol lowered her bow slightly, still wary but curious. "How do you know so much about me?" she asked. "I watch," he replied simply. "I see without needing to judge. You live as I have lived, alone, wary of the world, yet capable of surviving it. That is something rare." There was a pause. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if even the forest understood the tension between them. Marisol wanted to run, as she had countless times when strangers approached, yet she could not. Something in his presence disarmed her in ways she could not name. I am not like the others," she said finally, the words spilling out in a rush. "They have branded me, made me a warning. No one comes near me." She hesitated, the pain of the memory sharp and immediate. "I am unwanted." Takoda stepped closer, but not threateningly. His eyes held neither disgust nor pity, only understanding. "I see the mark," he said quietly, nodding toward the place she instinctively covered with her hand. "But I do not see shame. I see a survivor. I see strength. And I see someone who is hers, not theirs." Marisol's breath caught. The villagers' cruel whispers had taught her to expect revulsion, mockery, or avoidance. But his words, spoken softly, firmly, without hesitation, were something else entirely. They carried acceptance, respect, and an unfamiliar warmth that made her pulse quicken and her defenses falter. For a moment she simply stared at him, unsure whether to trust what she was feeling. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand from her belly, not fully revealing the scar, but enough to test his reaction. Takoda's gaze did not waver. His eyes held a steady affirmation that made her chest ache with relief and disbelief. "You are not what they say," he said again, almost a promise. "You are more. You are Marisol. Not their whispers, not their judgment, not their fear." Marisol felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a release of the months of tension, fear, and isolation. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to demand explanations for the kindness she had never known. Instead, she simply nodded, letting the strange, gentle presence of this man fill the space around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, unjudged, and most importantly, safe. And deep in her heart, something stirred, a cautious hope, fragile but undeniable, that perhaps her life was on the verge of changing in ways she had never dared to imagine. The days that followed Takoda's first approach were unlike any Marisol had experienced since her branding. Each encounter in the forest became a delicate dance of curiosity, caution, and slowly unfolding trust. Unlike the villagers, he made no demands, issued no judgments, and asked no intrusive questions. Instead, he moved with a quiet patience, observing her rhythms, acknowledging her skills, and sharing the unspoken language of two people who had survived the harshness of the frontier. At first, Marisol maintained distance. She watched him from behind trees, half hoping he would leave, half hoping he wouldn't. She was wary of being betrayed again, of seeing kindness turn into judgment or ridicule. Yet Takoda's presence was steady, predictable in a way that felt comforting, and she began to notice patterns in his movements. He gathered wood, fished in the river, and set traps with careful precision. He respected the forest as much as she did, never taking more than he needed, leaving traces of care in his wake. Curiosity began to outweigh caution. One morning, she followed him silently through a narrow trail along the riverbank. He noticed her, of course, but offered no threat, no words meant to startle her. Instead, he began to speak softly, describing the landscape in simple observations, the flight patterns of birds, the behavior of deer, the subtle signs of the wind shifting. At first, she replied with nothing more than nods, listening to the calm cadence of his voice, the way he treated every detail of the forest as something sacred. Over time, small conversations began to form. She told him about the herbs she gathered, the techniques she used to set snares, and the ways she tracked game. He listened with intent, occasionally offering tips drawn from his own experience, never belittling her knowledge, never undermining her skill. With each interaction, she felt the fragile threads of trust slowly knitting between them. One afternoon, while she was mending a tear in her worn cloak, Dakota squatted beside her, quietly watching her hands. "You move carefully," he said. "Every stitch is deliberate. That's why you survive." Marisol's fingers froze mid-thread. She had never been praised for her work, only judged for what she could not control. The simplicity of his observation, the absence of condescension, made her chest tighten. I have to be careful," she admitted. "The world, it doesn't forgive mistakes." Her voice was quiet, almost ashamed, but he did not flinch. "Nor should it," he said. "But some mistakes are not yours. Some blame is not yours to carry." The words, soft yet firm, struck her in a way nothing else had in years. He was acknowledging not only her skills, but the injustice she had endured, without demanding she relive it. Gradually, Marisol began to reveal small fragments of her life. She spoke of her cabin, her garden, and the routines that had kept her alive. She admitted the fears that accompanied her every step: fear of the villagers, fear of strangers, fear of the cruelty embedded in human hearts. Dakota never pressed further. Instead, he offered companionship through presence, through shared silence, and through the gentle acknowledgement that she was not alone in the wilderness anymore. One evening, they shared a fire near the edge of the forest. Marisol roasted a small fish she had caught, while Dakota cleaned a deer trap he had set earlier. Words were sparse, but the air between them was comfortable, almost familial in its warmth. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the careful attention they paid to each other without the interference of judgment. "You are not like them," Dakota said quietly, nodding toward the distant village. "They try to define you by fear, by lies, by what they cannot understand. But you are more. You are seen here, not for their judgments, but for yourself." Marisol felt the weight of his words in her chest, a mixture of relief and disbelief. For so long, she had been defined by what she could not control, marked by cruelty and suspicion. Here, in the quiet forest, someone recognized her as a whole person. Someone saw her skill, her strength, her courage, not her scar, not her past. The bond between them was subtle, growing in the small, unspoken ways of shared moments. He learned her routines. She observed his attentiveness to the land. They began to anticipate each other's movements, instinctively stepping aside or offering aid without a word. Slowly, Marisol allowed herself to laugh again. Small, quiet. Laughter that felt like a release from months of tension. It was not love yet, not in the sense of passion or possession. It was something deeper, rooted in respect, trust, and the recognition of shared strength. In Dakota, Marisol found someone who could see her fully, not as the branded girl the village despised, but as a survivor, a warrior in her own right, and a human being worthy of connection. And in that recognition, for the first time in years, Marisol began to imagine a life where she might not just survive, but live, freely, fully, and unashamed. The village had grown restless. Rumors of a stranger in the forest had spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of fearful women and judgmental men. Some claimed he was a threat. Others whispered that he was an omen, a spirit come to punish the town for their sins. And when the villagers glimpsed Marisol near the edge of the woods, her face pale, her movements wary, they saw only confirmation of their own fears. Marisol had sensed the shift long before it reached its peak. The market had grown colder, the whispers sharper, the children more brazen in their mockery. She had avoided them as always, moving along the edges, clutching her cloak over the scar on her belly. But one morning, she could not avoid the confrontation. It began with a shout. "Marisol!" The voice was harsh, the tone edged with accusation. A group of men, led by one of the town's most arrogant farmers, had spotted her gathering water near the well. Their eyes glinted with self-righteous anger, fueled by the stories they had told themselves for months. "You have no place here. No man will touch you with that mark." Her pulse spiked, a familiar mix of fear and anger. She tightened her grip on the bucket and tried to step back, but the circle of men closed in. "I am just getting water," she said quietly. But the words were drowned by their laughter and shouts. "You dare show your face?" one man sneered. "The brand is there to remind everyone you are cursed." For a moment, Marisol felt the familiar sting of helplessness. Her training, her skill, and her independence had not prepared her for this kind of collective malice. She could have fled, disappeared into the forest, but the thought of leaving Dakota's presence, or even the idea of standing silently while injustice prevailed, stirred a spark she could not ignore. A movement in the trees caught her eye. Dakota stepped from the shadows, his presence calm but commanding, every motion deliberate. The villagers froze, unsure what to make of the tall, broad-shouldered man who emerged as though part of the forest itself. "You will leave her alone," Dakota said, his voice low, steady, and filled with authority. There was no threat in the words, yet the certainty behind them carried more weight than any shout or weapon. The men laughed nervously, attempting to mask their unease. "And who are you to tell us what to do?" one of them demanded, stepping closer. "I am someone who sees the truth," Dakota replied. "And the truth is that she does not belong to your cruelty. She belongs to herself. She is not cursed. She is strong. She is alive, and you will not take that from her." Marisol felt something inside her shift. She had lived under the weight of shame for too long, had accepted that her body and her life were at the mercy of others' judgment. But now, seeing Dakota's unwavering defense, she understood something profound. She was not powerless. She could, and would, stand for herself. One of the men stepped forward, a smirk twisting his face. "Strong? Look at the brand. Who would ever want her?" Dakota's eyes met Marisol's. In that glance, she found courage she thought had been buried under months of isolation and ridicule. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her shirt just enough to reveal the scar. The villagers recoiled, expecting submission, shame, or despair. But Dakota did not flinch. Instead, his gaze softened with recognition, admiration, and quiet defiance. "She is not defined by that mark," he said firmly, "and she is mine." The words hit the villagers like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the group, disbelief and unease replacing arrogance. Dakota stepped closer to Marisol, not to threaten her, but to shield her, placing himself as both protector and witness to her courage. Marisol's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a newfound strength. The weight of shame lifted slightly, replaced by the affirmation that she had survived this long not because of their approval, but because of her own resilience. She met the villagers' shocked stares with steady eyes. "I am Marisol," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not cursed, Not unwanted, not yours to judge. I am mine, and I choose who stands beside me." The village men, confronted with the unexpected power of her defiance and Takoda's calm authority, began to retreat. The women, previously eager to judge, looked away, uncertain how to respond to this display of self-possession and protection. For the first time in months, Marisol felt the whispers fade, the eyes soften, and the weight of imposed shame lift, if only slightly. As the villagers dispersed, Marisol turned to Takoda. He gave her a small, approving nod, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of relief, gratitude, and trust. She understood that this was more than protection. It was acknowledgement of her worth, her strength, and her right to choose her own path. For the first time in a long while, Marisol felt the stirrings of hope. The turning point had come. Not through escape, not through hiding, but through the quiet assertion of identity, courage, and the presence of someone who saw her truly. And in that moment, the path forward, uncertain as it remained, no longer seemed impossible. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, carrying the scent of dry earth and pine from the forest toward the village. Marisol stood at the edge of the clearing, her chest rising and falling in measured breaths. The confrontation with the villagers had left her shaken, yet alive in a way she hadn't felt for months, stronger, sharper, and more aware of her own power. She had always thought survival was enough, but now she realized survival was just the beginning. She could claim her life on her own terms. Takoda remained close, his presence steady and unintrusive. He did not speak unless necessary, instead, letting her lead, letting her feel the weight of her own courage. His calm attention, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the certainty in his gaze gave her space to center herself. In the weeks since his arrival, the forest had become their shared sanctuary, a place where judgment was absent and understanding was absolute. The villagers' murmurs still echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the world she had left behind, but Marisol no longer felt the need to shrink from them. She had faced their cruelty, felt it, and stood in defiance. The mark on her belly, the scar that had once been a source of humiliation, now felt like a symbol of endurance, a testament to the trials she had survived. Takoda's gaze followed her movements, patient and quiet. He had never asked her to explain the brand, never demanded that she recount the past that had made her an outcast. Instead, he had seen her skills, her strength, her courage, and treated her accordingly. His respect had been the bridge from isolation to trust, and now it led toward something deeper, something neither of them had named but both felt. As she adjusted the folds of her cloak to cover the scar once more, Takoda stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering clarity. There was no question in his voice, only certainty. "Show me," he said simply. Marisol's fingers trembled slightly as she hesitated. The act felt both terrifying and liberating, a reclaiming of ownership over a part of herself that had been used against her. The villagers had branded her to strip her of agency, to make her feel unwanted, to tell her she was defined by their judgment. But here, with Takoda, it was different. Here, she could define herself. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted the edge of her shirt. The scar, raw and vivid against her pale skin, glimmered faintly in the dappled sunlight filtering through. The trees, her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, uncertain how he would react. Years of fear, isolation, and shame had trained her to expect disgust or ridicule, yet she felt none of that now, only a quiet, unwavering presence beside her. Takoda's eyes softened, a mixture of acknowledgement and admiration filling his gaze. He reached out gently, not to touch, not to claim in a way that violated her, but to stand as a witness to her courage. "You are strong," he said quietly, voice steady and warm. "You are unbroken, and you are mine." The word struck her with a force that made her stagger inwardly. Not because of ownership in the way the villagers had tried to impose, but because they carried recognition, affirmation, and acceptance. He was saying that she was seen fully, with all her scars and survival intact. She was no longer defined by the cruelty of others. She was defined by her strength and by the acknowledgement of someone who truly understood her. For the first time in years, Marisol felt the brand not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to her resilience. She allowed herself to meet Takoda's gaze fully, letting the weight of his affirmations settle over her like a protective cloak. The scar had once been a symbol of rejection, but now, in this defining gesture, it became a bridge, a connection between the life she had endured and the life she was beginning to claim. The forest around them seemed to lean in, the wind rustling through the trees as if echoing the significance of the moment. The sunlight danced across the clearing, illuminating both their faces and highlighting the scar that had once been her burden. And in that quiet, sacred space, Marisol understood something profound. The mark did not define her. She did. Takoda's hand hovered briefly near her shoulder, not touching, merely a presence of protection and solidarity. "No one else can tell your story," he said softly. "It belongs to you, and I will stand beside you, not as judge, but as witness and companion." Marisol's lips curved into a small, tentative smile. She felt lighter, freer, more herself than she had in months, or perhaps years. The defining gesture was not simply the revelation of the scar, nor the declaration of Takoda's claim, but the recognition that she had agency, choice, and the right to be seen as she truly was. In that moment, the forest, the scar, and Takoda's unwavering gaze became a sanctuary. The world beyond the trees, the village, the whispers, the judgment, faded to insignificance. Marisol was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to live, fully, freely, and unashamed, and with Takoda by her side, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it not as an outcast, but as a woman who had reclaimed her story and her power. The morning sun broke over the horizon, spilling gold across the forest floor, as if the world itself was signaling a new beginning. Marisol stood at the edge of her cabin, taking in the sight of her small garden, the paths she had carved through the trees, and the familiar landmarks of the wilderness she had called home. Everything felt different now. The confrontation with the villagers was behind her, and Takoda's presence beside her had transformed fear into confidence. She no longer felt the invisible chains of shame tightening around her chest. For months, isolation had been her armor. It had protected her, allowed her to survive, and taught her skills she never would have developed in the village. But now, standing at the threshold of the forest and the unknown, she realized that survival alone was no longer enough. She wanted more: freedom, companionship, and the right to define her life on her own terms. She wanted to step fully into the person she had been fighting to become. Takoda approached silently, his footsteps soft against the earth. He carried a small bundle of supplies, simple and practical, as always. "The path ahead is yours to choose," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "I will follow, but the steps are yours." Marisol looked at him, her chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and determination. She had spent so long reacting to the world, hiding from judgment and bearing the weight of imposed shame. Now, for the first time, she could act for herself. She could leave behind the village that had branded her, the people who had tried to define her, and the life of quiet, fearful existence she had known for far too long. I think it's time," she said, her voice firm, carrying a confidence that had been forged in the forest and tempered by survival. "It's time to leave this place." Takoda nodded, offering a small, approving smile. He said nothing more, respecting the choice she had claimed. His patience, his steadfastness, and his unwavering presence had been more than protection. They had been a mirror, showing her that she could be strong and whole, that she could reclaim the life that had been denied to her. Marisol moved with purpose, gathering her few belongings, a bundle of clothes, her bow and arrows, a small knife, and the leather satchel where she kept herbs and tools she had fashioned herself. Each item was a symbol of the life she had built in isolation, of the independence she had fought to preserve. And yet, they were also tools for the future, a future she would define for herself, not the villagers. The path through the forest felt alive beneath her feet, sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across the ground. Every step forward felt like shedding an old skin, leaving behind fear, shame, and the constant scrutiny of judgmental eyes. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Marisol felt the exhilaration of choice. She was no longer running or hiding. She was walking toward a life she had chosen on her own terms. As they emerged from the trees, Marisol allowed herself a small glance back at the village. It sat quietly in the distance, unaware that the girl they had tried to brand into shame was leaving, not in defeat, but in triumph. The people who had whispered, judged, and shunned her would not define her anymore. Their opinions, their cruelty, their fear, all of it belonged to them. She carried only the lessons and the strength she had earned through endurance and courage. Dakota walked beside her, silent, his presence steady and reassuring. He did not speak, for words were unnecessary. The connection they had forged in the forest, the trust, the respect, the recognition of one another's strength, was enough. Together, they would face the unknown, not as protector and protected, but as equals, each bringing skills, courage, and resolve to the journey ahead. Marisol's heart lifted as they crossed the final ridge, the sun fully illuminating the vast expanse of plains beyond the forest. Here, in the open space, free from the village's judgment and the shadow of the brand, she could breathe fully, deeply, for the first time in her life. The future stretched before her, unwritten and full of possibilities. She could build, explore, love, and exist without apology or fear. And as she walked, bow slung across her back, eyes bright with determination, and Dakota at her side, Marisol realized something profound. Liberation was not merely the absence of oppression. It was the presence of choice, the reclaiming of agency, and the courage to step fully into one's own life. The village, the scars, the whispers, they were all behind her. Ahead lay freedom, respect, trust, and the promise of a life defined not by others, but by her own courage and the bonds she chose to nurture. In that moment, Marisol smiled, a true, unburdened smile. She was free, she was whole, and for the first time she was entirely, irrevocably herself. The open plains stretched endlessly before Marisol, golden and untamed, dotted with wild flowers and swaying grasses. The wind carried the scent of freedom and the subtle promise of adventure. For the first time in her life, she felt truly unbound, unmarked by judgment, unshackled from shame, and fully alive in a world that offered no pre-written role, no imposed limitations. Beside her, Dakota walked with quiet confidence, every movement deliberate yet effortless, like a shadow that mirrored her own steps. There was no need for conversation. Their bond had grown through shared silence, mutual respect, and the trust forged in the forest. Words could never fully capture what had developed between them, a profound understanding that transcended spoken language. They walked side by side, each step a confirmation that they were equals, companions in survival, in courage, and in life. Marisol's eyes roamed the horizon, taking in the rolling hills, the distant rivers that glittered like silver threads, and the open skies that seemed to stretch farther than she had ever imagined. For years she had been confined by the village's cruelty, branded not only in body but in spirit. taught that her worth was determined by others. Now, with nothing but the wind and the earth around her, she felt the exhilarating weight of her own choices. Her hands brushed over the bow slung across her back, a familiar weight and a symbol of her independence. Everything she carried, the bow, her arrows, the small knife, and the leather satchel of tools and herbs, was a testament to the life she had forged alone. But now, she was not alone in the same way. Beside her walked Takoda, a companion who respected her autonomy, who recognized her strength, and who would share the journey without diminishing her identity. As they stopped near a small stream, Marisol knelt to cup the cool water in her hands. The reflection staring back at her was unfamiliar in a way that startled her. Not because she did not recognize herself, but because the reflection seemed free. Her eyes, once guarded and haunted, now shone with clarity and purpose. The scar on her belly, once a mark of humiliation, felt like a badge of survival, a testament to every trial she had endured and overcome. She allowed herself to smile, a genuine expression of joy that rose from her core rather than the surface. Takoda knelt beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He did not reach for her, nor did he need to. The bond between them was anchored in respect, not possession. "The land is vast," he said softly, "but it does not define you. Your path will." Marisol nodded, feeling the truth in his words. She had walked through the forest alone, confronted cruelty, survived the harshness of the village, and reclaimed her life in small acts of courage and resilience. Now, in this wide open world, she understood that freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was the power to choose, to act, and to live on her own terms. They continued walking, following the undulating curves of the land. Marisol's senses were alive to every sound, every movement, the call of a distant bird, the rustle of the grass, the shift of the wind across the plains. She felt connected to the earth in a way that transcended mere survival. She felt in harmony with it, part of its rhythm, a participant in its endless cycles. And alongside her, Takoda shared that connection, not as a guide or protector, but as a companion who matched her strength and understood her heart. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the future, not a life dictated by fear or the opinions of others, but a life of possibility. Perhaps they would find a place to build a home, hunt and forage together, explore rivers and forests beyond the plains, and share laughter and stories under the stars. Perhaps she would discover new strengths, face unknown challenges, and carve a life defined by courage and choice rather than judgment. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and crimson, Marisol felt the weight of the past settle gently behind her. The brand, the whispers, the scorn, they no longer held power over her. They were memories, lessons, and reminders of the woman she had become, but they did not dictate who she was meant to be. Takoda glanced at her, eyes calm, steady, and filled with unspoken affirmation. In that glance, Marisol found a reflection of her own determination, a recognition that they would face the world together, each as whole, strong, and independent as the other. She took a deep breath, the wind filling her lungs and carrying away the last remnants of fear. She was free. She was alive. She was no longer defined by the cruelty of others, only by her own courage, choices, and the life she had claimed for herself. And as she walked forward, side by side with Takoda into the vast golden expanse, Marisol realized that she was not merely surviving. She was living, fully, boldly, and unashamedly. The plains stretched before them, endless and inviting, a canvas for the life she would now paint. And for the first time, Marisol smiled without restraint, a smile that carried the weight of the past, but the promise of an unbound future. She was whole, she was free, and she was finally, irrevocably herself.